message. We are glad that you are hanging with us in this series on the book of Ruth. As we continue to count 50 days from Passover to Shavuot, it's a Jewish tradition to read the book of Ruth on Shavuot. And so as we approach a Shavuot in the middle of June, we are going through the book of Ruth together. I've said the last few weeks that the book of Ruth is simple, but it's never simplistic. It's a story of brokenness, pain, and suffering of human beings, and how God redeems the whole world through the ordinary and mundane details of their lives. The central theme of the book of Ruth is this movement from famine to fulfillment. And the story is the telling of Chesed, the loyal love of Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. It's read in synagogue on Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, in connection with the 50 days between Passover and Shavuot. And this story speaks of God's desire to fulfill his promises, to even through the most likely people, like an outsider, a Moabite named Ruth. And she is the unmistakable hero of the story as she commits to build the house of Israel by becoming the great-grandmother of King David. It's a story of how the God of Israel can move anyone from any nation, from famine to fulfillment, when they call on the name of Yeshua. So the JPS commentary says that Ruth is a journey from Bethlehem and back. It's a journey from famine to fullness, from futility to fertility. And God is still today working through hurting, broken, selfish, manipulating people. And just like Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, and just like you and me, because we're all human beings, God is faithful in the ordinary and mundane decisions of our lives as well. And we're to remain faithful, to do the things we're commanded to do by God, and represent God in this Tov Meod creation, this very good creation of his. So today, in part 3 of the book of Ruth, we're talking about work as worship. As the modern sage Rihanna once said, you just got to get ready for work. Work goes back to creation. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, it says, God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the land, conquer it. Rule over the fish and the sea, the flying creatures of the sky, and over every animal that crawls on the land. So human beings were made to be kings over creation, but not with the unrestrained power and authority of bad kings and examples of bad kings, but with care and compassion. In the same way that the kings of Israel are supposed to rule, but often don't, after the book of Ruth. There's this the idea that to work the ground is a part of the order of creation. And when Adam and Eve eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in their disobedience, the work then, as a result of the fall and sin entering the world, work becomes hard and difficult. It says in Genesis 3, verse 17, then to the man he said, because you listened to your wife's voice and ate of the tree which I commanded you, saying you must not eat of it, cursed is the ground because of you. With pain you will eat of it all the days of your life, and thorns and thistles will sprout for you, and you will eat the plants of the field, but by the sweat of your brow will you eat food until you return to the ground, since it is where you were taken from. For you are dust, and to dust you will return. So working the ground is a part of the job in the Garden of Eden. But painful, difficult, sweaty work is a consequence of the fall of man, sin entering the world in the Garden of Eden. So even in pain and difficulty, we're to treat, and this is what we're talking about today, we're to treat work as worship. Why? Because God's first act of chesed, his loyal love, we talked about last week, was creating the world for our enjoyment, and he gave us this Tov Meod, this very good creation. So we return the chesed by being faithful and diligent in the work that we do, even through pain and difficulty. So this all goes back to God's covenant with the people of Israel in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 3. He said, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and carry them out, then I will give you rain in their season. The land will yield its crops, and the trees of the field will yield its fruit. Your threshing will last until grape gathering. The grape gathering will last until the sowing time, and you will eat bread to the full and live securely in the land. Now, this is not transactional like the pagans around Israel. It has to do with the heart and relationship. If you seek God and you work hard to do all that he's commanded, then he will be with us. If we turn to the gods of the nations around us and we turn away from the one true God, then he will remove his blessing, but only until we repent and return back to God. And this is what the story of Ruth represents, that the children of Israel were under these 400 years of judges. And in the book of Judges, they go from bad to worse to really bad. And they turned away from God, the people, and worshiped other gods. And so God brought famines to turn the people back. But the cycle would continue. We talked about it in the first message of this series. There's 400 years of a cycle of Israel's sin. It starts sin, oppression, repentance, deliverance, peace. Sin, oppression, repentance, deliverance, and peace. Sin, oppression, repentance, deliverance, and peace for 450 years. And we've already learned in this series through Ruth that if you want to move from famine to fullness, you have to return to God. And in returning to God, you find the undeserved and unconditional, the contagious and the transformative, the covenantal and the eternal chesed of God. And then we're able to share that chesed with both those who deserve it and also those who don't deserve it, because we don't deserve any of the loyal love that God has shown us. So when God commands us to do things and we do it, there is blessing. But the work we do is not to get a transactional blessing from God. The work we do is an overflow of our love and affection for the God of Israel. Michael Todd said it this way on a podcast. He said, blessing is always on the other side of obedience. I love that idea, that blessing is always on the other side of obedience. So chapter 1 of Ruth ends with verse 22. It says, so Naomi and her daughter-in-law, Ruth the Moabitess, returned from the region of Moab, and they arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And we know there was, chapter 1, there was a famine in the house of bread, Bethlehem, presumably because of these 400 years of the cycle of Judges. And because of the famine, the family of Elimelech leaves the house of bread to find bread. Now, after all the men die in the wilderness, Naomi returns to Bethlehem with a Moabite daughter-in-law, and the house of bread is back in action, presumably because the people of Israel have repented and returned to the God of Israel, and now there's a barley harvest again. There's no longer a famine. So chapter 2 introduces, after Naomi and Ruth, the third main character of the book, of Ruth. It says in chapter 2 and verse 1, now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from Elimelech's family, a prominent man of substance whose name was Boaz. Now, these words, prominent man of substance, are better translated a man of valor. It's a similar word that's used for Gideon, one of the judges in Judges chapter 6. And it's a man of noble character. It's actually the male equivalent of the woman in Proverbs 31 and verse 10, which is called the woman of valor, which Boaz uses that phrase in chapter 3 to refer to Ruth. They're the only 3 times that these phrases are used in the scriptures. And it's important because Boaz is a prominent man. He's a man of valor. And Ruth, apparently, in chapter 3, he refers to Ruth as a woman of valor. But Boaz means strength in Hebrew. And he's the only person in the Hebrew Bible that has that name. Most names repeat and are used over and over again. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, from before the first century, from the last 2 centuries of BCE, the Septuagint translates his name as strength into Greek, and there's probably a phrase like the strength of the Lord. So there's this really amazing contrast between Ruth's dead husband, Mahon, which means sickly, and the strength that's found in this relative of Elimelech. There's this lack of trust in God by the man named My God and My King, Elimelech, who runs away from the house of bread to find bread in Moab, where bread was not offered to Israel when we left Egypt. And this relative from the clan of Elimelech, which the clan is this subdivision of larger tribe of Judah, whose name seems to come from strength of the Lord, who never left Bethlehem in the famine and now is reaping a harvest of barley and wheat in the house of bread. Again, it's like sickly versus strength. It's fear versus trust. The only other place in the Bible where Boaz, the name, shows up is one of the names of 2 pillars of Solomon's temple that are mentioned in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. And perhaps, because it means strength, Boaz was probably bigger and stronger than Mahon, both physically and spiritually. It was like an upgrade for Ruth. So, verse 2, it says, Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go out to the field and glean the grain behind anyone in whose eyes I may find favor. Naomi said, yeah, sure, go ahead. It's funny because she's not very concerned for Ruth's life at this point. But Ruth, the Moabite, which is emphasized at least 5 times throughout the story of Ruth. It's this reminder that Ruth is a foreigner in a strange land who left the land of her parents. It's a callback to Abraham, who left the land that of his father and his family that he knew to go to a land that he did not know. So Ruth is doing the same thing. But here, Ruth gleans grain. And her request to her mother-in-law is, let me go and do what foreigners, widows, and orphans are allowed to do, to glean in the fields behind the men who are doing the work of harvesting. Now, gleaning is the act of collecting the leftovers that fall on the ground when the workers of the fields would harvest the fields and cut the wheat or the vineyard for grapes or olive trees. And there's a commandment in the Torah, Leviticus chapter 19, which says to Israel, when you reap the harvest of your land, you're not to reap to the very corners of the field, nor are you to gather the gleanings of your harvest. You are not to pick the remnants of your vineyard, nor are you to gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. Instead, you're to leave them for the poor and for the outsider. I am the Lord your God. Now, after instructing in Leviticus 23 is the list of all the holidays. And as Leviticus 23 explains Shavuot and the 50 days, the counting of the Omer, at the end of it, it says in verse 22, now when you reap the harvest of your land, you're not to reap to the furthest corners of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Rather, you're to leave them for the poor and for the outsider. I am the Lord your God. This is a connection from the description of Shavuot and the 50 days of the counting of the Omer to what Ruth does during the days of Omer when she collects the grain as a widow and an orphan. Deuteronomy 24 repeats it. When you reap your harvest in the field and you've forgotten a sheaf in the field, you're not to turn back to get it, for it is for the outsider, for the orphan, and for the widow, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all the works of your hand. So in Ruth chapter 2 and verse 3, it says, so Ruth went out and gleaned in the field behind the reapers, and she just so happened to be in the field of Boaz, who was from Elimelech's family. Now, just so happened in Hebrew is not like, and it happened by chance, as we would say in English. One Rabbi Hirsch, in commentary, Art Scroll commentary, said this. He said, nothing is further from the Jewish concept of happening than the idea of chance with which is associated. Rather, it refers to those moments of one's life that he himself did not direct, but which directed him. They were not only events which were not expected, not reckoned on, not intended, but which all the more could be the most intentional messages sent by the one who directs and brings about all things. What seems like ordinary and mundane decisions by human beings is often what God uses to show himself in powerful ways, and that's what's happening in the book of Ruth. So Ruth does what she's supposed to do. Ruth goes to work. She does everything she can to get what she needed for her and Naomi to survive. It's the commitment that she made to Naomi on their way to Bethlehem. And of the three main characters in the book, Ruth has the fewest words. Boaz talks a lot. Boaz is a man of words, but Ruth is a woman of action. And Boaz is a man of honor, as Ruth, we find out, is a woman of honor, both mentioned from these words that are used in Proverbs 31. And Boaz is faithful to do the things that the Torah commands in his fields, like he allows women and orphans and widows and foreigners to glean the harvest. In the day of the judges, which Ruth has set, this was not so everywhere. Everyone in Israel did what was right in their own eyes, it says at the end of the book of Judges, which means they did whatever they wanted. They took what they wanted. They took advantage of the poor and the orphan and the foreigner. But Boaz, who represents strength of the Lord, and the famine is now over because people like Boaz repented for the years of the judges, and they began again to do what the Lord commanded. And so the story jumps from death and famine to harvest and fullness. In the house of bread, there's now enough bread for everyone. So Boaz arrives from his home to his fields in Bethlehem, and he sees this woman, and he asks the workers who she is, and the workers say, well, she's a Moabite who returned to the place she never lived with Naomi. She asked to glean in the fields, and she's been working all day with very little rest. So verse 8 of chapter 2, it says, Boaz said to Ruth, listen to me, my daughter. Do not go glean in another field or even pass on from here, but stay close to my female workers. Keep your eyes on the field as they are harvesting, and follow after them. I strongly ordered the young men not to touch you. When you are thirsty, you can go to the jars and drink from the water that the young men have drawn. Interesting that here an Israelite offers a Moabite water, as the Moabites did not offer Israel bread and water when we left Egypt. And Boaz tells Ruth to stay with his female workers. He assures her that she's not going to be raped or harmed. And because Boaz is a man of honor, she's safe, and his workers do not harm her. And things seem to be turning around in the time of the judges, that God has brought back rain and harvest back to Israel. And men like Boaz are doing all they're supposed to do in the land because there was a famine. But now there's an overabundance of everything that Israel needs. So in verse 10 of chapter 2, it says, then she fell upon her face, and bowing to the ground, she said to him, why have you found favor in your eyes that you have noticed me, even though I am a foreigner? And Boaz replied and said to her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since your husband's death, sickly, has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not know before. May Adonai repay you for what you've done, and may you be fully rewarded by Adonai, God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. I love that sentence, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. If God protects his people, who do what they are commanded to do, then those who live under God's protection should extend the same protection to those who cannot protect themselves. Boaz is saying, may Adonai repay you for what you've done. And he takes it upon himself to provide Ruth with everything she needs. He protects her, and he gives her work, and he gives her water, and then he invites her to eat with him at lunch in the middle of the day. And it says in verse 14 of chapter 2 that she ate until she was full, and some was still left. And then in verse 17, it says, so she gleaned the field until evening, and when she thrashed what she had gathered, there was about an ephah of barley, and she carried it back to town where her mother-in-law saw that what she had gleaned, and Ruth took some out and gave her what was left over after eating her fill. You remember in chapter 1 that Naomi said when they arrived in Bethlehem, the house of bread, she said, I went away full, but Adonai has brought me back empty. Now they have more than they need. They have an overflow. And now, all of a sudden, Naomi's concerned. Okay, she says in the following verses, okay, when you go back, make sure you don't get raped. Well, why didn't she say that the first time that Ruth said, I'm going into the field? She was like, deuces. And she gives Ruth all kinds of instructions. When she first asked Naomi if she could go, Naomi said nothing. She just said, yeah, go ahead. And I think it was because in her sadness and her bitterness, she had just given up. But Ruth takes it upon herself to go to work. And Ruth treated her work as worship. She does everything she can, not even knowing whose field to work in. And it just so happened, as God orchestrates things, that she ended up in Boaz's field. She now has this invitation to harvest in Boaz's field for the entire season. That the last verse of chapter 2, it says she gleaned until both the barley harvest and the wheat harvest were completed. That is all 50 days of the Omer between Passover and Shavuot, the days that we're still counting together. So when Ruth returned from the fields with all of this food in her hands, not just the gleaned leftovers, but the abundance of the good sheaves of grain, which Boaz told his workers to wrap up and give it to her, then Naomi begins to wake up from her bitterness. And Naomi's bitterness is about to return to the real meaning of her name, pleasant. Her name means pleasant, but when they got to Bethlehem, she said, call me Mara, which means bitter, and she has been stuck in that bitterness. But now it's about to shift back to pleasant through the chesed of Ruth. Verse 19, it says, her mother-in-law asked her, well, where did you glean today? And where did you work? May the one who noticed you be blessed. She told her mother-in-law whom she had worked with. And she said, the name of the man whom I worked for is Boaz. Boaz? So Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by Adonai, who has not stopped his chesed to the living or to the dead. Then Naomi said, this man is closely related to us. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. We're going to talk about that later. But chesed, kindness. The Lord has not stopped showing kindness. It's the second time in the book of Ruth of 3 times that the word chesed is used. And Boaz has shown chesed. So Naomi says, may God bless him because of his chesed. And why does Boaz show chesed to Ruth? Because of the chesed she showed to her mother-in-law and her dead husband. Last week we talked about how chesed has this domino effect. The hard work also has a domino effect. Ruth didn't just sit back and wait for God to do something. She got up and she went to work, and ending up in the right field at the right time and with the right relative. And as images of God, those who are made in the image of God, human beings, we should all work as an act of worship. I love how Daniel Block said it in his commentary. This is like one of my new phrases. I'm going to make t-shirts. He said, within the divine economy, we need to work like an ox and relax like a lily. Work like an ox and relax like a lily. That is the challenge of work as worship. We have to work like an ox and relax like a lily. Yeah, I feel like that's a great bumper sticker or a t-shirt. And it comes from actually when Yeshua, our Messiah, spoke to the disciples about worrying. He said to them, if God cares for birds and for lilies and gives them everything they need, how much more will he provide for you? Then Yeshua said to his disciples in Luke chapter 12 and verse 29, he said, so do not seek what you will eat and what you will drink, and do not keep worrying, for all the nations of the world strive after these things. But your Father knows you need these things. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things shall be added to you. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father chose to give you the kingdom. We got to work like an ox and relax like a lily. So I want to give you these 4 reminders for how we can treat our work as worship. 4 reminders of what it means why it's important to treat work as worship. The first is, food is God's gift for hard work. If harvest equals money and money buys food, the problem in our culture is most of us are not farmers. But the work that we do helps us provide for our families. And when we work hard, God gives us everything we need. It goes back to creation. Yes, work is hard and painful in this present age. And there is an age to come where pain and difficulty will be gone. So in the here and now, we work as an act of worship because everything we have comes from God. It's the blessing we say over the bread. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Amen. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who gives bread from the earth, because God provides the bread. We work the ground to get it out of the earth. And then we not just use it to support our own families, but we share it with those who don't have bread. The second thing that's important in our work as worship is we have to remember that we represent Yeshua in our work. How we treat people matters. How we treat employees and coworkers and teachers and clients and other human beings matter. We work hard and we work with integrity and diligence and compassion and hope and joy and peace and the like. If every human being is made in the image of God, and they are, then we must treat every image of God as God would treat us. We say it here at Restoration all year. We've been saying it in 2024, that how you act matters, that we are authentic, charitable, and teachable people. And how you act matters because you are reflecting the God in whose image you were made. So being kind and respectful and helpful and honest and treating everyone the way you would want to be treated is important. The third reminder for the importance of worship as work is an expression of chesed. When we work hard and we work with diligence and excellence, we take all the God-given responsibility to care for our families and the people around us seriously. We don't see ruling as an excuse to do whatever we want. We understand that God commanded us to care for people as He, our King, cares for us. Chesed gives birth to chesed. Whatever your work is, Daniel Block in his commentary says it this way. He says, every legitimate occupation is God's work. I like legitimate occupation. You can do a lot with that. Every legitimate occupation is God's work. Through us and our work, He makes and designs and organizes and beautifies and helps and leads and cultivates and cares and heals and empowers and informs and decorates and teaches and loves. Like Boaz offers the wings of God to Ruth, so you and I can become the wings of God forever. It's an expression of Hesed. The fourth is work is a reminder of our dependence on God. We cannot fall for our own importance or claim credit for our own accomplishment. Yes, your hard work is worth celebrating, but everything we have and everything we do and everything we are comes from our relationship with God. We have to find ways to give God glory in our work. We are participants in this Tov Meod creation, this very good creation. And we must remember that God created us and this beautiful creation in an act of chesed. That's why we find ways to return to God from what He gives us. This is why we believe in tithes and offerings, because we're not giving, we're returning. And it helps us remember that all of the Tov Meod things, the very good things, come from a Tov Meod king. I think if we remember those four things, we can remember how important our work is as worship. Because every job and every project offers opportunities to worship God in the work, to enjoy His blessings, and to give Him thanks for all the Tov Meod that comes from our work. So friends, as Yeshua said to His disciples, do not worry, do not be afraid. The King has given us His kingdom, and when we work for the glory of God, He will provide everything you need in this Tov Meod creation. Not just to provide for you and your family, but to be a physical manifestation of the chesed of God to the other images of God around you. I love you guys, and I hope you'll come back next week as we continue this series on Ruth and lead to the day of Shavuot.